I don't know, some of you might follow me for the sort of general drug policy work that I do. I do speaking at conferences and public speaking and various media and journalists all over the place. And I've been doing that for a few years as part of LEAP. But a couple of years ago, as a result of, I suppose, developing my understanding about the growth of organised crime around the world, transnational organised crime, I came to the conclusion that we cannot solve the climate crisis without first getting rid of the international drug prohibition regime. We can't. Like, it's a complete barrier. Like, we're fucked unless we can get rid of these drug laws, to put it as bluntly as I need to be doing. Now, some of you may be aware of various ways how drug policy intersects with the climate crisis in terms of, the lack of regulation causes harm. So there's loads of examples, loads of them. So, for example, the MDMA manufacturing industry in the Netherlands is destroying the waterways because all of the wastewater from that unregulated industry is going into the water. Or the restrictions of the use of hemp, for example, which is really good at soaking up carbon. So those kind of restrictions. Or you've got the waste products from the cocaine industry, or you've got the way that the opium industry in Afghanistan uses up all the underground water. So it's turning Afghanistan into a desert. There's so many, I could reel them off. I've been reading and studying this for the last few years. So there's so many of these reasons why the unregulated drug business is causing environmental harm. But all of those individual issues are nothing compared with the real problem. The real problem is the growing power of transnational organised crime. There's an organisation which studies transnational organised crime called GITOC. So those of us that move in law enforcement circles and study these kind of things, we read everything they put out. GITOC is the Global Initiative into Transnational Organised Crime. Now, they have to be really careful in what they say because of who they're funded by. They're funded by Europol, the UNODC. Basically, these machines of prohibition fund them. And they do this research into what's happening with organised crime. So they publish all these documents, like loads of them, but they're never allowed to say the real conclusions. But about 16 months ago, they brought out a sort of strategic assessment document, a really very broad study into the growing power of transnational organised crime. And the conclusion, the headline of that document was that the growing power of transnational organised crime is the single biggest threat to our security and our democratic way of life. The single biggest threat. Powerful words from a worldwide organisation. Now, bearing in mind where their funding comes from, I don't know how they managed to get this sentence into that report, but there is a one-sentence paragraph in that report that says, we recommend the global reset of drug policy. Now, that's pretty strong language for GITOC on drugs, because they're not allowed to say, we really think this whole drug policy regime worldwide is empowering organised crime. They're not allowed to say that, but that's what they meant. And I know that they meant that because I spend a lot of time speaking to the researchers. And actually some of the researchers are quietly part of a coalition that is now taking shape to spread the word about this problem. But before I tell you about the coalition and the people in it and what we're trying to do about it, let me explain how I came to these conclusions. The big problem is corruption. Because the international drug business is the fourth biggest business in the world. It's bigger than textiles. And we're all wearing textiles, right? It's bigger than textiles. It's $500 billion, a conservative estimate worldwide. One estimate puts the cocaine industry alone at $200 billion a year. $200 billion. That is an entirely unregulated business where all of the profits go into organised crime. Now, when we talk about organised crime, really we're talking about drugs organised crime, because everything else that organised crime do is funded by the drug market. Everything. Even the National Crime Agency, who are also very shy at the logical conclusions. Even the National Crime Agency published in one of their strategic documents in the last 3 years that the money, the value of the illicit drug markets are routinely reinvested into other forms of criminality. Now, another way of wording that is that the money from the illicit drug markets makes other forms of organised criminality possible. Because we all know, you want to start a business, you need capital, right? Well, the drug markets are the investment bank for everything else that organised crime do. Counterfeiting, people trafficking. But the most important reinvestment that organised crime do is into corruption. Let me explain the mechanism of how that works. So, I remember an undercover operation I did in Nottingham, and I was trying to organise the periphery of an organisation called the Bestwood Cartel, which was headed by a very infamous gangster called Colin Gunn. I didn't get that close to his organisation. I was buying heroin off people on the edges, and I remember one day I got interrogated with a knife pressed into my groin, which is really off-putting. It is. It makes conversation difficult, let me put it that way. So that, eventually he sold me some drugs, and it was strange. He even brought his 12-year-old son along, actually, for that. He was teaching his 12-year-old son, family business, that kind of thing. And he dressed his 12-year-old son up exactly like him. Same shaved head, same tracksuit, two-piece tracksuit, same trainers, same gold chain. Like a mini-me. It was really strange. And he brought him along while he threatened my bollocks with a knife. The day after that event, I went into a morning briefing and 2 of my team went off sick. So I was introduced to 2 new cops to the operation. I didn't know who these were. So I was unsettled. I didn't like having new people 4.5 months into an operation. Anyway, I met one of them, shook his hand, had no problem with him. The second one, I shook his hand and just the hairs went up on the back of my neck. Instinctively, everything about this guy was wrong. Because when you've been working undercover for months, your senses, you're picking up of body language, the finer points of body language are really high-powered. You're on the verge of paranoia. And this guy was wrong. So I went to the guy running the operation. I said, look, boss, I cannot have this guy knowing what I'm doing. I don't trust him. And he was great. He says, well, we'll exclude them both so they don't ask any questions. They've not been to the briefing. They don't know anything about the job. So you're okay. So I was reassured. I let it drop. A year later, when the Bestwood Cartel was brought down by this huge operation by Nottinghamshire Constabulary, and Colin Gunn was arrested, it turned out that the police officer I'd taken exception to was an employee of Colin Gunn. So the gangster had managed to infiltrate my team much closer than I'd managed to infiltrate his. And he was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. He'd been in the police for 7 years by the time I met him, and he was recruited to join the police. He wasn't corrupted once he was in there. He was paid to join the police. And of course, organised crime are going to do that. Why would they not do that? Why would they not do that everywhere? Well, they do. That's the point. They do that. And I remember a debrief from that. I met a senior covert police officer in the UK. And he says, look, Woodsy, of course we know this happens. Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? With this much money involved. And I must make it very, very clear, there is no other form of criminality that can pay for that type of corruption, because there isn't enough money in any other kind of criminality. This is about drugs being illegal. But it's not just the value that causes the corruption, it's actually the mechanism of policing. I'll explain. If you catch a kingpin character or a gang or whoever controls the heroin supply for half of a city, you create a gap in that market. And more often than not, it causes violence because people fight over that opportunity. But actually, the person who is most able to take up that opportunity is the person who controls the other half of the city. So what you do over time, the natural mechanism of drugs policing causes monopolies. Or it causes cooperatives. If anyone's seen The Wire, it's based on real events. It causes cooperatives. And this happens at every single level all over the world. All over the world. One of the best examples was actually announced, weirdly, by the National Crime Agency just about 2 years ago. I had no idea why they made this public. I normally have to find this out through spies. But they said that they have credible intelligence that British organised crime groups that import drugs had formed an alliance, a cooperative with the Italian mafia. Two organisations which were traditionally at odds with each other, but now they're a cooperative. And now that because they're a cooperative, well, we know how business mergers work, right? It makes them more effective. It makes the business more streamlined. They're sharing assets. And most importantly, if you've increased your share in the market, you increase your disposable income. And if you increase your disposable income, you will always invest it in corruption. Organised crime will always invest it in corruption because that's the most important part of the business model, by a long way. And so this constant policing of the drug markets at every level, including the cooperation between international law enforcement agencies, has created these super cartels, this behemoth of transnational organised crime, which is now this huge threat to even our democratic way of life. Examples of how this is playing out around the world. For example, Mexico. There used to be 20 cartels in Mexico. Now there are 3. And those 3 cartels in Mexico have a bigger GDP than most West African countries. They are using that wealth to corrupt those West African countries. So you now have narco states, like completely run by organised crime, completely. Guinea-Bissau, Senegal in West Africa, and there's more. There's been 5 military coups in the last 3 years in West Africa. Now, nothing new, you might say. The post-colonial hangover means that we've created poverty and inequality and instability in those areas. Yeah, fine. That's a colonial hangover. However, the most recent coups have all been about one thing: control of the biggest asset. And the biggest asset is the profits from the cocaine trade, which now goes across the Atlantic into West Africa, where it's distributed around the world. It's completely corrupted those countries. They're not legitimate governments anymore. The military coup in Guinea was just to establish the army as the biggest drug gang. That's all it was. You've got Honduras, Venezuela to a slightly different degree, but it's still a narco state. And even where the central governance isn't completely corrupted, local governance is. So lots of people are celebrating Lula retaking control of Brazil to save the Amazon. But since Lula's become president, the deforestation's gone up because the power has been decentralized by organised crime. Now, what this means, of course, is that these most destabilized and most corrupted nations, corrupted, I should add, not because they're in the global south, not because they're poorer countries, but because the global drug trade is global. What it means is that most of those countries are on the equator, which is the most important region of the world for the climate crisis. Now, at COP26, the big headlines were about how naughty Australia was because they were still digging up coal, and that was all the headlines. And yeah, coal's important, but it's not as important as stopping the trees being cut down, because you can eventually put pressure on Australia, and it worked, actually. Australia is now stopping digging up the coal. You can put pressure on because Australia are a legitimate government with strong governance. So they will follow international law if you pass a law about coal. The forests, the trees are more important than coal, because once you've cut the trees, it takes a few hundred years to grow them back. The trees are slightly more important. But the problem is, all of the equatorial countries that turned up at COP26 just 18 months ago, just over 18 months ago, and signed the well-celebrated deforestation pledge, that signature was meaningless. Because most of those governments, they don't control their own backyard. They don't. Drugs, organised crime controls that backyard. So they can sign it as much as they like. But the climate crisis that is obviously gathering in danger with every passing month, the climate crisis, in order to solve it, we need good governance. You have to have good governance to have good regulation and good control of your environment. And that governance is being eroded daily because transnational crime is getting more powerful daily. And we're making it more powerful by the mechanism of policing, by continuing to fight this war on drugs. So I'm trying to think of other examples. Fishing. There's various things which are also adding and speeding up the damage. So you've got illegal fishing. So there's some fish are going to be extinct, which are being overfished off the coast of Brazil. For example, you've got illegal mining, which is causing huge amounts of damage to the Amazon. You've got environmental protesters being murdered, over 1,500 in the last few years. All of these things are happening because of the structures, the infrastructures created by drugs, organised crime. And the most important aspect of that is the corruption, because if you've corrupted a government, and the reason they corrupted an entire government is because it's cheaper than corrupting a customs official. You know, back in the old days, when you were your own little gang and you could only afford to pay off a police official, or you could only afford to pay off a customs official, once you become a big gang and a cooperative, well, it's much more efficient as a business to corrupt the whole government. But what that means is, because you've used that value, that vast wealth from the drug markets to corrupt the government, it makes every other bit of criminality, every other bit of environmental vandalism, or every other trade connected with the climate crisis easy, because you've already paid for the corruption. So you couldn't pay for that corruption with the value of the illegal mining alone, because there isn't enough value in that. You couldn't pay for that corruption with the illegal fishing alone. You couldn't pay for that corruption with the value that you make from the illegal logging. However expensive mahogany is, you still couldn't pay to corrupt an entire government with that value. But you don't need to, because the drug markets have already created a blanket corrupt system, which means you can smuggle what you want. You can smuggle rhino horn. You're not going to corrupt a government with the value in a rhino horn, but if some Chinese businessman says, could really do with a load of rhino horn, can you sort that out for me? Yeah, no problem. I know who's in my pocket for that, because I've already bought them off. But it's worse than that, because actually all of those other environmental crimes are also really good ways of laundering money. So it creates this complex system with the drug money at the top and a sort of dripping down pyramid of various secondary environmental crimes. Because logging is a good way of laundering drug money, of hiding it. Because you can use all of the legitimate wood markets you can't really, DNA test the tree. You can't really, once it's gone into those market systems, you can't say where that's come from. You can't say it was cut down illegally. So it's a good way of laundering money, really good. Illegal mining is a good way of laundering money because the gold, which is dug up in the Amazon, can just go into the gold trading market. Gold's gold. You can't say it's been created, it's come out of environmental vandalism. You can't. The fishing is the same. So you're increasing your wealth by this reinvestment, but this reinvestment is only possible because of the corrupt systems that have been put in place by the illicit drug market. And it's becoming more and more intricate and connected with literally with every passing year. Now, I'm hoping that I've got 10 minutes left. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just tell you what we're doing about it, what the coalition of people who are trying to get this information out there. And then there should be maybe 4 or 5 minutes for a question if anyone's got some questions ready. So basically, I've teamed up with people all over the world, really. But the most important person is Clemmy James from Health Poverty Action. She was going to be here, but she's putting an event on in Ghana on Monday, and she had to go into the embassy today because they're being difficult about her visa. So that's why she couldn't be here. She has really put a lot of work into to build a coalition of people who know about this. And so I'll mention a few of them. One of them is Kendra Sweeney, who is a geographer, a professor from Ohio University, and she's been researching this connection for a decade. So there is actually a great wealth of academic evidence backing up the things that I'm saying. Now, I should say a word of caution, though. There is a wealth of academic evidence backing up a lot of what I'm saying, but a lot of what I am saying in terms of the growth of organised crime, a lot of that is coming from police intelligence sources, which are not public. So you'll have to trust me that my organisation has the contacts, that we are getting this information, and that we understand the nature of organised crime and the serious threat that it is. But we've also got, yesterday we had one of our coalition speaking at Harm Reduction International Conference in Melbourne, and he's a professor at a university in Colombia. We've just got someone else in the team who's an academic from Brazil. We've got lots of other people from Brazil as well. We've got WOLA from the USA. We've got SOS Amazonia. We've got the Transnational Institute, who's based in the Netherlands. And of course, LEAP as well. We're bringing in new academics, new people, new activists all the time. We've recruited some people from not the leaders of these organisations, but some of the people who are doing the work from Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion. We're spreading the word, but the only way we are going to get some political pressure on this topic and actually spread it is if we become one movement with the environment movement. This is urgent, that we need to be factoring in this topic into the discussions and the activism around the environmental movement. Because as I said when I started, if we don't, we are fucked. We really are. I'm a full-time activist. It's my day every day. So I have to stay optimistic. Otherwise, I would probably go insane again. So I have to stay optimistic. But I'm hoping, and please, I'm going to leave these here. So please take these leaflets, follow LEAP, follow Health Poverty Action, and please look out for what we're going to be doing on this topic. And if you can think of a way of helping us, in particular, we need funding, please just get in touch with me. You can Google me and email me. Please, your support is welcome. Thank you.